If you're interested in ancient Egypt, one of the first things you'll notice is their mythology and how it directly related to their cosmology. Basically, the way that they viewed their universe had a lot to do with how they viewed their creation. And as a result, it'll come as no surprise to you that their lineages, their kings lists as we call them today, their historical documents, quite often stretched into time immemorial, and it gets into those dicey guys that had really long lifespans, and we'd have going all the way back to their creator god of Ptah, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing properly, and then we had, Horus and Osiris, and eventually the followers of Horus, or the Shemsu Hor, and again, pronouncing properly, I'm 100%, you can take that to the bank. But my point here is the Shemsu Hor is something that's been talked about a lot in the alternate history circles, and also in mainstream history circles. It's kind of a weird subject, as a matter of fact. You go to look for exact references to them, and you don't find a whole lot. But you do find a lot of people talking about them, and you find a lot of different ideas about them. So we're going to look into that a little bit today because, well, it's kind of an important thing, I think, because this is really critical. Like I said, mythology is very important, and considering that, like, the biggest Egyptologists in the world don't even know what the damn King's List are.
Have you heard about about the King's List, right? The old King's List that goes back 30,000 whatever years.
Who said that?
You never seen it? It's not in hieroglyphs?
This is not true.
It's not true?
All. No. This is a speculation from people who knows nothing about history. There is nothing King List dated back 30,000 years ago at all.
So why do people keep saying that?
Because they don't know. It's speculation. Give me one evidence of that. The first King List dated back to Dynasty 5. Only.
I was reading that people were saying that it was myth. That the King's List, even though there is like some hieroglyphics of ancient kings, that these are just mythical tales.
This is not true. There is no at all a name that you told me. I never heard of this name. I am an Egyptologist working in Egypt for the last 57 years. I never heard of this King List at all.
I figured it's up to an electrician to weigh in. So here we go. Let's talk about the King's List, how far back they seem to go, and what they seem to cover. Hi, my name is Dan, and welcome to Debunking. Now, looking for a complete King's List, this is impossible. I mean, only fragments of these things remain, and even the ones that we've found in good condition, like the Turin papyrus, which we'll discuss, we find it in good shape, but by the time it gets in the hands of the historians, it's a bunch of rubble and crap. And unfortunately, this is a big problem. So we don't have a King's List. We have a series of different documents that has been compiled together and evaluated to forge a list that Egyptologists generally agree on as being the lineage of kings throughout history. Now, dozens of those partial lists and even references made in other documents get used to flesh out those rulers, and the list we made from those sources is still incomplete. But the pieces, the historians, they more or less agree on what we have there. Now, some Egyptologists disagree about the exact positioning of certain kings and whether or not certain lineages were mythological or whether they were real or whether they were omitted. But one thing that almost every Egyptologist agrees on is the further back you go, the less reliable these documents become. And eventually we reach a point in prehistory where the details really don't make sense. The rulers lived for far too long, and they often get credited with mythological feats. Now, at this point, all the historians pretty much agree that we're looking at myth. I mean, nobody's going to accept that, people lived 300 or 1,000 years old back in those days. These are biblical numbers. And that brings up an important point. There's a trope, it seems, in the region that of these kinds of lineages, of these kinds of timelines in history, kind of making sense and then just kind of jumping the rails and going off into like craziness. It makes a modern historian disregard it. And we'll discuss the trope here in a little bit, but I think it's important first to talk about the Egyptian Kings List, because that's what you're here for, right? There are 3 separate lists that go back into mythological times that we currently have that are generally agreed upon to reference these times. The Royal Canon of Turin, known as the King's List of Turin, the Tombos Stela, and the Palermo Stone. Now, these 3 are fragmentary, the Palermo Stone being a section from a much larger record, the Tombos Stela being the most complete of the 3, and the Turin list was found in the 1820s, largely intact, and is now deteriorated to a horrific degree. But still, all three of these are very important documents when you're evaluating ancient Egyptian history, especially if you're going to talk about the followers of Horus and the pre-dynastic times. The Palermo Stone is a small chunk of what is known as the Royal Annals of the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, and it is the oldest of the three sources mentioned here. Now, the two of these sources that are technically kings' lists list Menes as the first king of a unified Egypt. And all of them do have mention of things from pre-dynastic times. While only 9 kings' names survive on the Palermo Stone, it is estimated that as many as 120 names were originally listed. And before these kings, we see a list of names under the umbrella term that translates to successors or followers of Horus. And these are often assumed to be the Shemsu Hor, as they are often called. Assumed to be, I hear you asking? Well, yes. It's a funny thing when you study Egyptology is it seems more myths came up in the last 200 years than came up in the last 5,000. It's wild. You get all kinds of little things that pop up that aren't exactly tangible. And this would be one of them. The Palermo Stone does indeed say things that would incline one to believe that there probably were references to the followers of Horus. If you know the timeline of ancient Egypt and you know what else to look for about the Ennead and the Lesser Ennead and however you pronounce those things, if you know all that crap already, which I'll put some links below if you're not up to speed on the very basics of ancient Egyptian mythology, but if you know the basics of it, then you know that this is where they would fit. However, it's very important to note there is no real mention on the Palermo Stone of the Shemsu Hor themselves. It is inferred, and I mean that's not. It's the oldest of the three. Like I said earlier, it seems like the older records seem to be a little bit less robust. It's the oldest of the three, and it's also considered the most questionable of the three as far as its reference to the followers of Horus. So, there's the Palermo Stone. The Tombos Stela is said to have been made about 3,500 years ago, and it mentions the followers of Horus in passing, and tells us that they were ancient, refers to them in an honorific, deferent tone that implies that they were superior to the rulers contemporary to the authors of the Stela. It speaks of no one having seen such a thing since the time of the followers of Horus and things like that. Basically, it just kind of refers to them as like these things that everybody seemed to already know what they were, right? Again, it kind of relies on some knowledge of ancient Egyptian mythology to begin with. For instance, near the end of the stela, after it's described the conquering of the region, we read the following: "Nor has anyone ever seen it in the annals of predecessors since the followers of Horus, one who always gives his breath to one who follows him, and his great offering to the one who adhered to his path." So there's plenty of ambiguity about the followers of Horus there. We don't really know a whole lot about them except at this point, but we know that they were kind of honored and that they were considered to have, been around a long-ass time ago. So that really just leaves us the Turin Papyrus, or the Turin Kings List. The Turin List Papyrus is the one that's most heavily cited to prove that the Shemsu Hor were real. Sadly, it's also the one that's very, very heavily damaged. It's really sad considering it was purchased mostly intact in the 1800s and traveling by donkey destroyed it, and to the point we just have these fragments. It's a curious list. It looks to be more of a piece of practice work done by a would-be scribe than an actual historic document. And one of the reasons for this is on the backside, there's a much older, much more mundane document where it just looked like it was written on the back of an old school receipt or something. Most of the document is missing, but in the beginning it does start with gods and the descendants of the gods, the followers of Horus and whatnot. Right at the very beginning, it's assumed that it would start with the god Ptah, but we don't have that section anymore. By the time it gets going, we're into the demigods, but it does seem clear that that's what would have been at the beginning. What we do know is the rest of the document seems to contain a lot of errors, and that's another reason that it's believed that this was a practice piece for a scribe in training as opposed to an actual document. Now, interestingly, it seems that the more recent the source is, the more likely it is to mention the followers of Horus in more detail. In the old times, it seems there was a belief in ancient Egyptian mythology that there were these early kings or early god kings, these followers of Horus. But it seems that over time that their history, that their idea of them got fleshed out more and more as we start to get stronger references to them and kind of these extra references as well, where there's not part of the Kings List. There's plenty of references to them that are mythological purely in nature, but these Kings List, this is where it kind of seems to meld the two halves, the upper and lower kingdom together, so to speak. And the Egyptians love to do that sort of duality of man shit, by the way. They loved gluing two things together and drawing symbolism between upper and lower Egypt. So Forgive me for playing Egyptian in my brain for a minute there. But my point here is this whole idea of historical and mythological being blended into one is something that wouldn't have violated the Egyptian idea of history or prehistory. As a matter of fact, they would have loved it. But in my opinion, what do I know? But my point here again is that this list does actually get this one's actually got some detail, and the further forward we go, the more we see these sorts of things. There are other references to them, but the big ones that are historical I've mentioned to you here. These are the three that you're going to hear referenced the most likely when somebody's talking about the Shemsu Hor. Now, lots of people have all other different kinds of ideas about what they may have been, technologically speaking. Some people believe that they guarded ancient technology. Some people believe they guarded ancient wisdom. Some people believe they were just like astronomer priests and mathematicians that were keeping some ideas around from a long time before. What is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea is not unique to the Egyptians or to the Israelites. And as I mentioned, the Bible does have a similar list. It goes back in time, and there's a point where it becomes kind of silly, and that time that it becomes kind of silly kind of corresponds pretty hard to when the Egyptians list becomes kind of silly. It's almost like the two were somewhat related. But even more importantly would be the Sumerian kings list. And now this is from another large kingdom in the area who definitely would have had some influence, the same influences hitting their mythology, but not necessarily the same mythology. And they have a very similar kings list where when you go back to the point before the flood, it gets crazy. The Sumerian kings list had 16 different sources, which also sometimes disagree, but it does go back to the antediluvian days. And after the flood, it begins with the modern list, but even then the rulers have reigns lasting hundreds or even thousands of years. Like the Egyptian or the biblical list, the closer to now that we get, the shorter the average time span becomes. It's almost like they were all referencing the same source material, perhaps an older tradition long lost in deep time at this point. This dovetails well with the work of Geoffrey Rose, who's an archaeologist. Now, he's of the opinion that the biblical account of Eden and other similar stories from Mesopotamia incorporate distant memories of a time when there was a fertile and lush area there that he likes to call the Gulf Oasis. This would have been before the flooding of the Younger Dryas and the loss of the Green Sahara. He believes the region would have been the best on the planet for the development of agriculture. Now, I'll leave some links to his work below. It's very interesting, and I intend to cover it in more detail. Now, the reason that I mention this is because Mr. Rose, well, you know, he likes to talk about the Sumerian kings list and how it also dovetails with the Egyptian kings list. And far be it from me to be accused of plagiarizing the man. I'm not stealing his work. Also, his idea of a Gulf Oasis is pretty compelling when you think about the idea of people remembering this lush garden that they felt like was made for humans and then they've been ejected from because it no longer is good for humans anymore. That's pretty interesting. It also explains why this center of human development from the old world just kind of pops up in the shittiest. I mean, come on, man. This is a horrible desert region. And it's like, oh yeah, but it was so fertile and everything. No, it was horrible. It was terrible. It was like, this is not a good place to live. You had to live like right on the rivers and stuff. And it was not a good time. So it seems very weird that people popped up right there. But according to Geoffrey Rose, you know, it makes sense because just before the Younger Dryas flood, we had a Gulf Oasis right there in the Gulf, and that would have been a place that people would have learned all of these skills, and then the survivors would have tried their best to have incorporated them into a new world that didn't really cater to them the same as it did before. Again, I'll put some links down below, and let me know if you want me to cover his work in more detail, because I would be happy to do so. Even if he's wrong about the Gulf Oasis and the origins of agriculture, Geoffrey Rose brings up some very interesting points, and he's talking about the potential for a long-lost civilization in an area of the world that is not very hospitable now. It would explain why Egypt was so powerful and so rich and knew so much so quickly into history, where by the 4,000 years ago they're building buildings that we're still in awe of today, and the rest of the world was more or less scratching in the mud, except for a few places, and one of them happened to be in the sand all around Egypt, all around that part of the world. Horrible freaking resources, natural resources, tons of rich people. It was really weird. So there is something there worth looking at. And that's where it gets really interesting to think about a lot of different things. I mean, you know, you can imagine like an ancient city that would have been, you know, promoted or promoting itself, excuse me, after it had been wiped out, or after the climate had changed, or whatever, and it was no longer what it was. And so the people going around and passing on their knowledge to their children, their children's children, and eventually it withering and dying and it becoming just a whisper of these people that had powers or the knowledge from so long ago. Now, those of you who watch me regularly know that I'm pretty skeptical about these sort of things, but let's just go ahead and daydream for a little bit. Imagine if under Giza's sands we were to find something like this. And this is the latest release from the Khafre Scan Team, the group of Italian scientists working with synthetic aperture radar to determine what lies beneath the surface of Giza. Now, this technology is controversial and hotly debated, and I've covered this in a previous video, linked below, but imagine if this scan is accurate. Imagine a city beneath the sands, a city made in a manner seemingly impossible without some sort of advanced technology, or something that we don't understand at least. Tunnels, shafts, staircases, all manners of chambers and rooms. An advanced civilization laying right under the paws of the Great Sphinx itself. Now, normally I don't like to be proven wrong, but if the Khafre Scan Team keeps at it and their data proves out to be accurate, or if the robots that Matt Bell's fixing to send up with the help of Zahi Hawass into the empty chamber inside of the Great Pyramid, the one the Muon scans found a decade or so ago, these things are liable to send us with all kinds of new information that we're about to crack open a lot of new knowledge about Egypt itself. And if we find out that it's ancient high technology, these guys were advanced beyond our wildest dreams, I'll be the first to make a video to say I was wrong. And I will love making that video. Have a good day.